Hello all, how is everyone doing today? For this tutorial, I have decided to go back to the basics. I will be showing you how to add seam allowances to pattern pieces. Exciting, right? Well, before I get started, it would be so amazing if you could subscribe and give this video a big thumbs up. Okay, so let's do this. As you can see, I've already started to draw on 1/2 inch seam allowance freehand. If your guesstimating game is strong, then I will 100% encourage you to use this method. However, for a more precise seam allowance, I would recommend using a ruler. My ruler here has horizontal and vertical lines at 1/8 of an inch intervals. This really helps with drawing on seam allowances. If you are going to use 1/2 inch seam allowance, place the 1/2 inch line of the ruler over the outline of your pattern. For round pattern shapes, it's better to draw short lines as you move the ruler around the shape. So follow the outline of the shape by moving the ruler around its edge. Maintain the 1/2 inch distance from the edge. This will definitely take some time as you are moving in very short intervals, but for a precise and consistent seam allowance, the shorter the lines around the curved edges, the smoother the seam allowance would be. So comparing my freehand seam allowance to the more precise one, you can see there is more of a consistency when using a ruler. In some instances, you can't always use a larger seam allowance. For example, if I was to use a 1/2 inch seam allowance around the duck outline, you can see that the neck will completely get lost within it. In this instance, I would use a much smaller seam allowance. I am now drawing a 1/8 of an inch allowance around the duck. As you can see, the neck doesn't disappear within the seam allowance, so when it comes to sewing it, you won't have a neckless duck. Now that you understand how to add a seam allowance to a pattern, we can now have a go at doing it on a front bodice pattern. I will show you how to draw darts on the pattern too. Front bodice patterns are usually cut on the fold of a fabric, so do not require a seam allowance. You can start by extending the center front line of the bodice. On the waistline, draw your 1/2 inch seam allowance. When there are darts involved, draw the seam allowance past the dart legs. Redraw the dart legs so that it touches the seam allowance. Then find the midpoint of the dart and mark it a short distance away from the seam allowance. Join the bottom of the dart legs to that point. Continue drawing your seam allowance until you get to the next dart. Draw the seam allowance on either side of the dart leg. Extend the dart legs to the seam allowance line. Find the midpoint of the dart and mark it a short distance away from the seam allowance. Then join the dart legs to that point. Carry on adding the seam allowance to the pattern. Don't forget to draw very short lines when going around curved areas. On straight edges, just line up your ruler with the edge and draw straight across. Say for example you want to finish the neckline with some bias binding, and so you require a smaller seam allowance. It's pretty easy to modify the seam allowance size. Just continue like normal but with a smaller seam allowance. So here I am using 1/4 of an inch instead of 1/2 an inch. Never ever forget to add your seam allowance to a pattern, or else it won't fit when you sew it together. I hope you found this video as comprehensive as possible. If you have any questions, please get in touch. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. And I will see you all next time. Bye!